I shall, in the future, again and again draw your attention to what I shall call language games. These are ways of using signs simpler than those in which we use the signs of our highly complicated everyday language. Language games are the forms of language with which a child begins to make use of words. The study of language games is the study of primitive forms of language or primitive languages. If we want to study the problems of truth and falsehood, of the agreement and disagreement of propositions with reality, of the nature of assertion, assumption, and question, we shall, with great advantage, look at primitive forms of language in which these forms of thinking appear without the confusing background of highly complicated processes of thought. When we look at such simple forms of language, the mental mist which seems to enshroud our ordinary use of language disappears. We see activities, reactions which are clear-cut and transparent. On the other hand, we recognize in these simple processes forms of language not separated by a break from our more complicated ones. We see that they can build up the complicated forms from the primitive ones by gradually adding new forms. Now, what makes it difficult for us to take this line of investigation is our craving for generality. This craving for generality is the resultant of a number of tendencies connected with particular philosophical confusions. There is A, the tendency to look for something in common to all the entities which we commonly subsume under a general term. We are inclined to think that there must be something in common to all games, say, and that this common property is the justification for applying the general term game to the various games, whereas games form a family of members, of which we have family likenesses. Some of them have the same nose, others the same eyebrows, and others, again, the same way of walking, and these likenesses overlap. The idea of a general concept being a common property of its particular instances connects up with other primitive, too simple ideas of the structure of language. It is comparable to the idea that properties are ingredients of things which have the properties, e.g., that beauty is an ingredient of all beautiful things, as alcohol is of beer and wine, and that we therefore could have pure beauty, unadulterated by anything that is beautiful. B, there is a tendency rooted in our usual forms of expression to think that the man who has learned to understand a general term, say, the term leaf, has thereby come to possess a kind of general picture of a leaf, as opposed to pictures of particular leaves. He was shown different leaves when he learned the meaning of the word leaf, and showing him the particular leaves was only a means to the end of producing in him an idea which we imagine to be some kind of general image. We say that he sees what is in common to all these leaves, and this is true if we mean that he can, on being asked to tell us certain features or properties which they have in common. But we are inclined to think that the general idea of a leaf is something like a visual image, but one which only contains what is common to all leaves. Galtonian composite photograph. This again is connected with an idea that the meaning of a word is an image or a thing correlated to the word. This roughly means we are looking at words as though they all were proper names, and we then confuse the bearer of a name with the meaning of a name. C. Again, the idea we have of what happens when we get hold of the general idea, leaf, plan, etc., is connected with the confusion between a mental state, meaning a state of a hypothetical mental mechanism, and a mental state, meaning the state of consciousness, toothache, etc. D. Our craving for generality has another main source, our preoccupation with the method of science. I mean the method of reducing the explanation of natural phenomena to the smallest possible number of primitive natural laws, and in mathematics of unifying the treatment of different topics by using a generalization. Philosophers constantly see the method of science before their eyes and are irresistibly tempted to ask and answer questions in the way science does. This tendency is the real source of metaphysics and leads the philosopher into complete darkness. I want to say here that it can never be our job to reduce anything to anything or to explain anything. Philosophy really is purely descriptive. Think of such questions as, are there sense data? And ask, what method is there of determining this? Introspection? Instead of, quote, craving for generality, quote, I could also have said, quote, the contemptuous attitude towards the particular case. Quote, if e.g. someone tries to explain the concept of number and tells us that such and such a definition will not do or is clumsy because it only applies to, say, finite cardinals, I should answer that the mere fact that he could have given such a limited definition makes this definition extremely important to us. Elegance is not what we are trying for. For why should what finite and transfinite numbers have in common be more interesting to us than what distinguishes them? Or rather, I should not have said, why should it be more interesting to us? It isn't. And this characterizes our way of thinking. The attitude towards the more general and the more special in logic is connected with the usage of the word kind, which is liable to cause confusion. We talk of kinds of numbers, kinds of propositions, kinds of proofs, and also of kinds of apples, kinds of paper, etc. In one sense, what defines the kind are properties like sweetness, hardness, etc. In the other, the different kinds are different grammatical structures. A treatise on pomology may be called incomplete if there exist kinds of apples which it doesn't mention. Here we have a standard of completeness in nature. Supposing, on the other hand, there was a game resembling that of chess, but simpler, no pawns being used in it. Should we call this game incomplete? Or should we call a game more complete than chess, if it in some way contained chess but added new elements? The contempt for what seems the less general case in logic springs from the idea that it is incomplete. It is in fact confusing to talk of cardinal arithmetic as something special as opposed to something more general. Cardinal arithmetic bears no mark of incompleteness, nor does an arithmetic which is cardinal and finite. There are no subtle distinctions between logical forms, as there are between the tastes of different kinds of apples. If we study the grammar, say, of the words wishing, thinking, understanding, meaning, we shall not be dissatisfied when we have described various cases of wishing, thinking, etc. If someone said, surely this is not all that one calls wishing, we should answer, certainly not. But you can build up more complicated cases if you like. And after all, there is not one definite class of features which characterize all cases of wishing, at least not as the word is commonly used. If, on the other hand, you wish to give a definition of wishing, i.e. to draw a sharp boundary, then you are free to draw it as you like, and this boundary will never entirely coincide with the actual usage, as this usage has no sharp boundary. The idea that in order to get clear about the meaning of a general term, one had to find the common element in all its applications has shackled philosophical investigation, for it has not only led to no result, but also made the philosopher dismiss as irrelevant the concrete cases, which alone could have helped him to understand the usage of the general term. When Socrates asked the question, quote, "What is knowledge?" quote, he does not even regard it as a preliminary answer to enumerate cases of knowledge. If I wish to find out what sort of thing arithmetic is, I should be very content indeed to have investigated the case of a finite cardinal arithmetic. For A, this would lead me on to all the more complicated cases. B, a finite cardinal arithmetic is not incomplete. It has no gaps, which are then filled in by the rest of arithmetic. What happens if from 4 till 4:30, A expects B to come to his room? In one sense in which the phrase "to expect something" from 4 to 4:30 is used, it certainly does not refer to one process or state of mind going on throughout that interval, but to a great many different activities and states of mind. If, for instance, I expect B to come to tea, what happens may be this. At 4 o'clock, I look at my diary and see the name B against today's date. I prepare tea for 2. I think for a moment, does B smoke? And put out cigarettes. Towards 4:30, I begin to feel impatient. I imagine B as he will look when he comes into my room. All this is called expecting B from 4 to 4:30. And there are endless variations to this process, which we all describe by the same expression. If one asks what the different processes of expecting someone to tea have in common, the answer is that there is no single feature in common to all of them, though there are many common features overlapping. These cases of expectation form a family. They have family likenesses, which are not clearly defined. There is a totally different use of the word expectation. If we use it to mean a particular sensation, this use of the words like wish, expectation, etc., readily suggests itself. There is an obvious connection between this use and the one described above. There is no doubt that in many cases, if we expect someone, in the first sense, some or all of the activities described are accompanied by a peculiar feeling, a tension. And it is natural to use the word expectation to mean this experience of tension. There arises now the question, is this sensation to be called the sensation of expectation, or the sensation of expectation that B will come? If the first case, to say that you are in a state of expectation, admittedly does not fully describe the situation of expecting that so-and-so will happen. The second case is often rashly suggested as an explanation of the use of the phrase, expecting that so-and-so will happen. And you may even think that with this explanation, you are on safe ground, as every further question is dealt with by saying that the sensation of expectation is indefinable. Now, there is no objection to calling a particular sensation, quote, the expectation that B will come, quote. There may even be good practical reasons for using such an expression. Only mark, if we have explained the meaning of the phrase, expecting that B will come in this way, no phrase which is derived from this by substituting a different name for B is thereby explained. One might say that the phrase expecting that B will come is not a value of a function expecting that X will come. To understand this, compare our case with that of the function I eat X. We understand the proposition I eat a chair, although we weren't specifically taught the meaning of the expression eating a chair. The role which in our present case the name B plays in the expression I expect B can be compared with that which the name Bright plays in the expression Bright's disease. Compare the grammar of this word when it denotes a particular kind of disease with that of the expression Bright's disease when it means the disease which Bright has. I will characterize the difference by saying that the word Bright in the first case is an index in the complex name, Bright's disease. In the second case, I shall call it an argument of the function, X's disease. One may say that an index alludes to something, and such an allusion may be justified in all sorts of ways. Thus, calling a sensation the expectation that B will come is giving it a complex name, and B possibly alludes to the man whose coming had regularly been preceded by the sensation. Again, we may use the phrase expectation that B will come not as a name but as a characteristic of certain sensations. We might, e.g., explain that a certain tension is said to be an expectation that B will come if it is relieved by B's coming. If this is how we use the phrase, then it is true to say that we don't know what we expect until our expectation has been fulfilled. Confer Russell. But no one can believe that this is the only way, or even the most common way of using the word expect. If I ask someone, whom do you expect? And after receiving the answer, ask again, are you sure that you don't expect someone else? Then in most cases, this question would be regarded as absurd. And the answer will be something like, surely I must know whom I expect. One may characterize the meaning which Russell gives to the word wishing by saying that it means to him a kind of hunger. It is a hypothesis that a particular feeling of hunger will be relieved by eating a particular thing. In Russell's way of using the word wishing, it makes no sense to say, I wished for an apple, but a pear has satisfied me. But we do sometimes say this, using the word wishing in a way different from Russell's. In this sense, we can say that the tension of wishing was relieved without the wish being fulfilled, and also that the wish was fulfilled without the tension being relieved. That is, I may, in this sense, become satisfied without my wish having been satisfied. Now, one might be tempted to say that the difference which we are talking about simply comes down to this, that in some cases we know what we wish and in others we don't. There are certainly cases in which we say, I feel a longing, though I don't know what I'm longing for, or I feel a fear, but I don't know what I'm afraid of, or again, I feel fear, but I'm not afraid of anything in particular. Now, we may describe these cases by saying that we have certain sensations, not referring to objects. The phrase not referring to objects introduces a grammatical distinction. If in characterizing such sensations we use verbs like fearing, longing, etc., these verbs will be intransitive. I fear will be analogous to I cry. We may cry about something, but what we cry about is not a constituent of the process of crying. That is to say, we could describe all that happens when we cry without mentioning what we are crying about. Suppose now that I suggested we should use the expression, I feel fear, and similar ones in a transitive way only. Whenever before we said, I have a sensation of fear, intransitively, we will now say, I am afraid of something, but I don't know what it is. Is there an objection to this terminology? We may say, there isn't, except that we are then using the word to know in a queer way. Consider this case. We have a general undirected feeling of fear. Later on, we have an experience which makes us say, now I know what I was afraid of. I was afraid of so-and-so happening. Is it correct to describe my first feeling by an intransitive verb? Or should I say that my fear had an object, although I did not know that it had one? Both these forms of description can be used. To understand this, examine the following example. It might be found practical to call a certain state of decay in a tooth, not accompanied by what we commonly call a toothache, an unconscious toothache, and to use in such a case the expression that we have a toothache but don't know it. It is in just this sense that psychoanalysis talks of unconscious thoughts, acts of volition, etc. Now, is it wrong in this sense to say that I have a toothache but don't know it? There is nothing wrong about it, as it is just a new terminology and can at any time be retranslated into ordinary language. On the other hand, it obviously makes use of the word to know in a new way. If you wish to examine how this expression is used, it is helpful to ask yourself, quote, what in this case is the process of getting to know like? What do we call getting to know or finding out? It isn't wrong, according to our new convention, to say I have an unconscious toothache, but what more can you ask of your notation than it should distinguish between a bad tooth, which doesn't give you a toothache, and one which does? But the new expression misleads us by calling up pictures and analogies, which make it difficult for us to go through with our convention. And it is extremely difficult to discard these pictures unless we are constantly watchful. Particularly difficult when, in philosophizing, we contemplate what we say about things. Thus the expression, quote, unconscious toothache, quote, you may either be misled into thinking that a stupendous discovery has been made, a discovery which, in a sense, altogether bewilders our understanding, or else you may be extremely puzzled by the expression, the puzzlement of philosophy, and perhaps ask such a question as, how is unconscious toothache possible? You may then be tempted to deny the possibility of unconscious toothache. But the scientist will tell you that it is a proved fact, and there is such a thing. And he will say it like a man who is destroying a common prejudice. He will say, quote, surely it is quite simple. There are other things which you don't know of, and there can also be toothache which you don't know of. It is just a new discovery. You won't be satisfied, but you won't know what to answer. This situation constantly arises between the scientist and the philosopher. In such a case, we may clear the matter up by saying, let's see how the word unconscious, to know, etc. is used in this case, and how it is used in others. How far does the analogy between these uses go? We shall also try to construct new notations in order to break the spell of those which we are accustomed to. We said that it was a way of examining the grammar, the use of the word to know, to ask ourselves what, in the particular case we are examining, we should call getting to know. There is a temptation to think that this question is only vaguely relevant, if relevant at all, to the question, quote, what is the meaning of the word to know? We seem to be on a sidetrack when we ask the question, what is it like in this case to get to know? But this question really is a question concerning the grammar of the word to know. And this becomes clearer if we put it in the form, quote, what do we call getting to know? It is part of the grammar of the word chair that this is what we call to sit on a chair. And it is part of the grammar of the word meaning that this is what we call explanation of the meaning. In the same way, to explain my criteria for another person's having a toothache is to give a grammatical explanation about the word toothache, and in this sense, an explanation concerning the meaning of the word toothache. When we learn the use of the phrase so-and-so has a toothache, we were pointed out certain kinds of behavior of those who were said to have a toothache. As an instance of these kinds of behavior, let us take holding your cheek. Suppose that by observation I found that in certain cases, whenever these first criteria told me a person had a toothache, a red patch appeared on the person's cheek. Supposing I now said to someone, I see A has a toothache, he's got a red patch on his cheek. Now one may go on and ask, how do you know that he has got a toothache when he holds his cheek? The answer to this might be, I say he has a toothache when he holds his cheek because I hold my cheek when I have a toothache. But what if we went on asking, and why do you suppose that a toothache corresponds to his holding his cheek, just because your toothache corresponds to your holding your cheek? You will be at a loss to answer this question and find that here we strike rock bottom. That is, we have come down to conventions. If you suggest as an answer to the last question that whenever we've seen people holding their cheeks and asked them, what's the matter, they have answered, I have a toothache. Remember that this experience only coordinates holding your cheek with saying certain words. Let us introduce two antithetical terms in order to avoid certain elementary confusions. To the question, how do you know that so-and-so is the case, we sometimes answer by giving criteria and sometimes by giving symptoms. If medical science calls angina an inflammation caused by a particular bacillus, and we ask in a particular case, why do you say this man has got angina? Then the answer, I have found the bacillus so-and-so in his blood, gives us the criterion, or what we may call the defining criterion of angina. If on the other hand the answer was, his throat is inflamed, this might give us a symptom of angina. I call symptom a phenomenon of which experience has taught us that it coincided in some way or other with the phenomenon which is our defining criterion. Then to say a man has angina if this bacillus is found in him is a tautology, or it is a loose way of stating the definition of angina. But to say a man has angina whenever he has an inflamed throat is to make a hypothesis. In practice, if you were asked which phenomenon is the defining criterion and which is a symptom, you would in most cases be unable to answer the question except by making an arbitrary decision, ad hoc. It may be practical to define a word by taking one phenomenon as the defining criterion, but we shall easily be persuaded to define the word by means of what, according to our first use, was a symptom. Doctors will use names of diseases without ever deciding which phenomena are to be taken as criteria and which as symptoms. And this need not be a deplorable lack of clarity. For remember that in general, we don't use language according to strict rules. It hasn't been taught to us by means of strict rules either. We, in our discussions, on the other hand, constantly compare language with a calculus proceeding according to exact rules. This is a very one-sided way of looking at language. In practice, we very rarely use language as such a calculus. For not only do we not think of the rules of usage, of definitions, etc., while using language, but when we are asked to give such rules, in most cases we aren't able to do so. We are unable clearly to circumscribe the concepts we use, not because we don't know their real definition, but because there is no real definition to them. To suppose that there must be would be like supposing that whenever children play with a ball, they play a game according to strict rules. When we talk of language as a symbolism used in an exact calculus, that which is in our mind can be found in the sciences and in mathematics. Our ordinary use of language conforms to this standard of exactness only in rare cases. Why then do we, in philosophizing, constantly compare our use of words with one following exact rules? The answer is that the puzzles which we try to remove always spring from just this attitude towards language. Consider as an example the question, what is time, as St. Augustine and others have asked it. At first sight, what this question asks for is a definition, but then immediately the question arises, what should we gain by a definition, as it can only lead us to other undefined terms? And why should one be puzzled just by the lack of a definition of time and not by the lack of a definition of chair? Why shouldn't we be puzzled in all cases where we haven't got a definition? Now, a definition often clears up the grammar of a word, and in fact, it is the grammar of the word time which puzzles us. We are only expressing this puzzlement by asking a slightly misleading question, the question, what is? This question is an utterance of unclarity, of mental discomfort, and it is comparable with the question why, as children so often ask it. This too is an expression of mental discomfort and doesn't necessarily ask for either a cause or a reason. Hertz, Principles of Mechanics. Now the puzzlement about the grammar of the word time arises from what one might call apparent contradictions in that grammar. It was such a contradiction which puzzled St. Augustine when he argued, how is it possible that one should measure time? For the past can't be measured because it has gone by, and the future can't be measured because it has not yet come, and the present can't be measured for it has no extension. The contradiction which here seems to arise could be called a conflict between two different usages of a word. In this case, the word measure. Augustine, we might say, thinks of the process of measuring a length, say, the distance between two marks on a traveling band which passes us, and of which we can only see a tiny bit, the present, in front of us. Solving this puzzle will consist in comparing what we mean by measurement, the grammar of the word measurement, when applied to a distance on a traveling band, with the grammar of the word when applied to time. The problem may seem simple, but its extreme difficulty is due to the fascination which the analogy between two similar structures in our language can exert on us. It is helpful here to remember that it is sometimes almost impossible for a child to believe that one word can have two meanings. Now, it is clear that this problem about the concept of time asks for an answer given in the form of strict rules. The puzzle is about rules. Take another example, Socrates' question, what is knowledge? Here the case is even clearer, as the discussion begins with the pupil giving an example of an exact definition, and then analogous to this, a definition of the word knowledge is asked for. As the problem is put, it seems that there is something wrong with the ordinary use of the word knowledge. It appears we don't know what it means, and that therefore perhaps we have no right to use it. We should reply, there is no one exact usage of the word knowledge, but we can make up several such usages which will more or less agree with the ways the word is actually used. The man who is philosophically puzzled sees a law in the way a word is used, and, trying to apply this law consistently, comes up against cases where it leads to paradoxical results. Very often, the way the discussion of such a puzzle runs is this. First, the question is asked, what is time? This question makes it appear that what we want is a definition. We mistakenly think that a definition is what will remove the trouble. As in certain states of indigestion, we feel a kind of hunger which cannot be removed by eating. The question is then answered by a wrong definition. Say, quote, time is the motion of the celestial bodies, quote. The next step is to see that this definition is unsatisfactory. But this only means that we don't use the word time synonymously with motion of the celestial bodies. However, in saying that the first definition is wrong, we are now tempted to think that we must replace it by a different one, the correct one. Compare with this the case of the definition of number. Here, the explanation that a number is the same thing as a numeral satisfies that first craving for a definition. And it is very difficult not to ask, well, if it isn't the numeral, what is it? Philosophy, as we use the word, is a fight against the fascination which forms of expression exert upon us. I want you to remember that words have those meanings which we have given them, and we give them meanings by explanations. I may have given a definition of a word and used the word accordingly, or those who taught me the use of the word may have given me the explanation. Or else we might, by the explanation of a word, mean the explanation which, on being asked, we are ready to give. That is, if we are ready to give any explanation. In most cases, we aren't. Many words in this sense, then, don't have a strict meaning. But this is not a defect. To think it is would be like saying that the light of my reading lamp is no real light at all, because it has no sharp boundary. Philosophers very often talk about investigating, analyzing the meaning of words. But let's not forget that a word hasn't got a meaning given to it, as it were, by a power independent of us. So that there could be a kind of scientific investigation into what the word really means. A word has the meaning someone has given to it. There are words with several clearly defined meanings. It is easy to tabulate these meanings. And there are words of which one might say, they are used in 1,000 different ways, which gradually merge into one another. No wonder that we can't tabulate strict rules for their use. It is wrong to say that in philosophy we consider an ideal language as opposed to our ordinary one. For this makes it appear as though we thought we could improve on ordinary language. But ordinary language is all right. Whenever we make up ideal languages, it is not in order to replace our ordinary language by them, but just to remove some trouble caused in someone's mind by thinking that he has got hold of the exact use of a common word. That is also why our method is not merely to enumerate actual usages of words, but rather deliberately to invent new ones, some of them because of their absurd appearance. When we say that by our method we try to counteract the misleading effect of certain analogies, it is important that you should understand that the idea of an analogy being misleading is nothing sharply defined. No sharp boundary can be drawn round the cases in which we should say that a man was misled by an analogy. The use of expressions constructed on analogical patterns stresses analogies between cases often far apart. And by doing this, these expressions may be extremely useful. It is in most cases impossible to show an exact point where an analogy begins to mislead us. Every particular notation stresses some particular point of view. If, e.g., we call our investigations philosophy, this title, on the one hand, seems appropriate. On the other hand, it certainly has misled people. One might say that the subject we are dealing with is one of the heirs of the subject, which used to be called philosophy. The cases in which particularly we wish to say that someone is misled by a form of expression are those in which we would say he wouldn't talk as he does if he were aware of this difference in the grammar of such and such words, or if he were aware of this other possibility of expression, and so on. Thus, we may say of some philosophizing mathematicians that they are obviously not aware of the difference between the many different usages of the word proof, and that they are not clear about the difference between the uses of the word kind when they talk of kinds of numbers, kinds of proofs, as though the word kind here meant the same thing as in the context kinds of apples. Or we may say they are not aware of the different meanings of the word discovery, when in one case we talk of the discovery of the construction of the Pentagon, and in the other case of the discovery of the South Pole. Now, when we distinguished a transitive and an intransitive use of such words as longing, fearing, expecting, etc., we said that someone might try to smooth over our difficulties by saying the difference between the two cases is simply that in one case we know what we are longing for, in the other we don't. Now, who says this, I think, obviously doesn't see that the difference which he tried to explain away reappears when we carefully consider the use of the word to know in the two cases. The expression, the difference is simply, makes it appear as though we had analyzed the case and found a simple analysis, as when we point out the two substances with very different names hardly differ in composition. Now, when we distinguished a transitive and an intransitive use of such words as longing, fearing, expecting, etc., we said that someone might try to smooth over our difficulties by saying the difference between the two cases is simply that in one case we know what we are longing for, and in the other we don't. Now, who says this, I think, obviously doesn't see that the difference which he tried to explain away reappears when we carefully consider the use of the word to know in the two cases. The expression, the difference is simply, makes it appear as though we had analyzed the case and found a simple analysis, as when we point out the two substances with very different names hardly differ in composition. We said in this case that we might use both expressions, quote, we feel a longing, quote, where longing is used intransitively, and, quote, we feel a longing and don't know what we are longing for, quote. It may seem queer to say that we may correctly use either of two forms of expression which seem to contradict each other, but such cases are very frequent. Let us use the following example to clear this up. We say that the equation x squared equals minus 1 has the solution plus or minus the square root of minus 1. There was a time when one said that this equation had no solution. Now, this statement, whether agreeing or disagreeing with the one which told us the solutions, certainly hasn't its multiplicity. But we can easily give it that multiplicity by saying that an equation x squared plus ax plus b equals 0 hasn't got a solution, but comes alpha near to the nearest solution, which is beta. Analogously, we can say either, quote, a straight line always intersects a circle, sometimes in real, sometimes in complex points, quote, or, quote, a straight line either intersects a circle or it doesn't, and is alpha far from doing so, quote. These two statements mean exactly the same. They will be more or less satisfactory according to the way a man wishes to look at it. He may wish to make the difference between intersecting and not intersecting as inconspicuous as possible, Or, on the other hand, he may wish to stress it, and either tendency may be justified, say, by his particular practical purposes. But this may not be the reason at all why he prefers one form of expression to the other. Which form he prefers, and whether he has a preference at all, often depends on general, deeply rooted tendencies of his thinking. Should we say that there are cases when a man despises another man and doesn't know it? Or should we describe such cases by saying that he doesn't despise him, but unintentionally behaves towards him in a way, speaks to him in a tone of voice, etc., which in general would go together with despising him? Either form of expression is correct, but they may betray different tendencies of the mind. Let us revert to examining the grammar of the expressions to wish, to expect, to long for, etc., and consider that most important case in which the expression "I wish so-and-so to happen" is the direct description of a conscious process. That is to say, the case in which we should be inclined to answer the question, "Are you sure that it is this you wish?" by saying, "Surely I must know what I wish." Now compare this answer to the one which most of us would give to the question, "Do you know the ABC?" Has the emphatic assertion that you know it a sense analogous to that of the former assertion? Both assertions in a way brush aside the question, but the former one, regarding wishing, doesn't wish to say, "Surely I know such a simple thing as this," but rather, "The question which you asked me makes no sense." We might say we adopt in this case a wrong method of brushing aside the question. "Of course I know" could here be replaced by, quote, "Of course there is no doubt." And this interpreted to mean, quote, "It makes, in this case, no sense to talk of a doubt," quote. In this way, the answer, quote, "Of course I know what I wish," quote, can be interpreted to be a grammatical statement. It is similar when we ask, "Has this room a length?" and someone answers, "Of course it has." He might have answered, "Don't ask nonsense." On the other hand, "the room has a length" can be used as a grammatical statement. It then says that a sentence of the form, "The room is X feet long," makes sense. A great many philosophical difficulties are connected with that sense of the expressions "to wish," "to think," etc., which we are now considering. These can all be summed up in the question, quote, "How can one think what is not the case?" quote. This is a beautiful example of a philosophical question. It asks, how can one, and while this puzzles us, we must admit that nothing is easier than to think what is not the case. I mean, this shows us again that the difficulty which we are in does not arise through our inability to imagine how thinking something is done. Just as the philosophical difficulty about the measurement of time did not arise through our inability to imagine how time was actually measured. I say this because sometimes it almost seems as though our difficulty were one of remembering exactly what happened when we thought something, a difficulty of introspection or something of the sort, whereas in fact it arises when we look at the facts through the medium of a misleading form of expression. How can one think what is not the case? If I think King's College is on fire when it is not on fire, the fact of its being on fire does not exist. Then how can I think it? How can we hang a thief who doesn't exist? Our answer could be put in this form, quote, "I can't hang him when he doesn't exist, but I can look for him when he doesn't exist." We are here misled by the substantives, object of thought and fact, and by the different meanings of the word exist. Talking of the fact as a complex of objects springs from this confusion, confer, tractatus. Supposing we asked, how can one imagine what does not exist? The answer seems to be, quote, If we do, we imagine non-existent combinations of existing elements, quote. A centaur doesn't exist, but a man's head and torso and arms and a horse's legs do exist. Quote, but can't we imagine an object utterly different from any one which exists? Quote. We should be inclined to answer, quote, no, the elements, individuals, must exist. If redness, roundness, and sweetness did not exist, we could not imagine them, quote. But what do you mean by redness exists? My watch exists if it hasn't been pulled to pieces, if it hasn't been destroyed. What would we call destroying redness? We might, of course, mean destroying all red objects, but would this make it impossible to imagine a red object? Supposing to this one answered, quote, but surely red objects must have existed, and you must have seen them, if you are able to imagine them, quote. But how do you know that this is so? Suppose I said, quote, exerting a pressure on your eyeball produces a red image, quote. Couldn't the way by which you first became acquainted with red have been this? And why should it have been just imagining a red patch? The difficulty which you may feel here will have to be discussed at a later occasion. Editor, he does not do this. We may now be inclined to say, quote, as the fact which would make our thought true, if it existed, does not always exist, it is not the fact which we think, quote. But this just depends upon how I wish to use the word fact. Why shouldn't I say, quote, I believe the fact that the college is on fire, quote. It is just a clumsy expression for saying, quote, I believe that the college is on fire. To say, quote, it is not the fact which we believe, quote, is itself the result of a confusion. We think we are saying something like, quote, it isn't the sugar cane which we eat, but the sugar, quote, or, quote, it isn't Mr. Smith who hangs in the gallery, but his picture, quote. The next step we are inclined to take is to think that as the object of our thought isn't the fact, it is a shadow of the fact. There are different names for this shadow, e.g. proposition, sense of the sentence, but this doesn't remove our difficulty. For the question now is, how can something be the shadow of a fact which doesn't exist? I can express our trouble in a different form by saying, how can we know what the shadow is a shadow of? The shadow would be some sort of portrait, and therefore I can restate our problem by asking, what makes a portrait of Mr. N? The answer which might first suggest itself is, quote, the similarity between the portrait and Mr. N, quote. This answer, in fact, shows what we had in mind when we talked of the shadow of a fact. It is quite clear, however, that similarity does not constitute our idea of a portrait. For it is in the essence of this idea that it should make sense to talk of a good or a bad portrait. In other words, it is essential that the shadow should be capable of representing things as in fact they are not. An obvious and correct answer to the question, what makes a portrait the portrait of so-and-so, is that it is the intention. But if we wish to know what it means, quote, intending this to be a portrait of so-and-so, quote, let's see what actually happens when we intend this. Remember the occasion when we talked of what happened when we expect someone from 4 to 4:30? To intend a picture to be the portrait of so-and-so on the part of the painter, e.g., is neither a particular state of mind nor a particular mental process, but there are a great many combinations of actions and states of mind which we should call intending. It might have been that he was told to paint a portrait of N and sat down before N, going through certain actions which we call, quote, copying N's face, quote. One might object to this by saying that the essence of copying is the intention to copy. I should answer that there are a great many different processes which we call, quote, copying something, quote. Take an instance. I draw an ellipse on a sheet of paper and ask you to copy it. What characterizes the process of copying? For it is clear that it isn't the fact that you draw a similar ellipse. You might have tried to copy it and not succeeded. Or you might have drawn an ellipse with a totally different intention, and it happened to be like the one you should have copied. So what do you do when you try to copy the ellipse? Well, you look at it, draw something on a piece of paper, perhaps measure what you've drawn, perhaps you curse if you find it doesn't agree with the model, or perhaps you say, quote, I am going to copy this ellipse, quote, and just draw an ellipse like it. There are an endless variety of actions and words having a family likeness to each other, which we call, quote, trying to copy, quote. Suppose we said, quote, that a picture is a portrait of a particular object consists in its being derived from that object in a particular way, quote. Now it is easy to describe what we should call processes of deriving a picture from an object, roughly speaking, processes of projection. But there is a peculiar difficulty about admitting that any such process is what we call, quote, intentional representation, quote. For describe whatever process, activity of projection we may, there is a way of reinterpreting this projection. Therefore, one is tempted to say such a process can never be the intention itself, for we could always have intended the opposite by reinterpreting the process of projection. Imagine this case. We give someone an order to walk in a certain direction by pointing or by drawing an arrow which points in the direction. Suppose drawing arrows is the language in which generally we give such an order. Couldn't such an order be interpreted to mean the man who gets it is to walk in the direction opposite to that of the arrow? This could obviously be done by adding to our arrow some symbols, which we might call, quote, an interpretation, quote. It is easy to imagine a case in which, say to deceive someone, we might make an arrangement that an order should be carried out in the sense opposite to its normal one. The symbol which adds the interpretation to our original arrow could, for instance, be another arrow. Whenever we interpret a symbol in one way or another, the interpretation is a new symbol added to the old one. Now we might say that whenever we give someone an order by showing him an arrow and don't do it mechanically, without thinking, we mean the arrow in one way or another. And this process of meaning, of whatever kind it may be, can be represented by another arrow, pointing in the same or the opposite sense to the first. In this picture which we make of meaning and saying, it is essential that we should imagine the processes of saying and meaning to take place in two different spheres.